June 20th, 1941, 5:30 a.m., Lviv, western Ukraine, then part of Poland, later occupied by Germany. The light filtered through the thin curtains of the ward, casting long gray stripes across the floor. On the bed lay Elena Romanova, 28 years old, a nurse with 5 years of experience, a graduate of the prestigious medical school in Kyiv. She woke not to the sound of an alarm, but to a deep, distant rumble, like someone had thrown a giant stone into water. It wasn't an explosion, it was the tremor of the earth, a harbinger of something far greater. At that moment, no one yet knew that within hours, Germany would launch its war against the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. But in Lviv, tension was already thick in the air. The streets were empty. Even the dogs were silent. Soldiers in worn uniforms, backpacks slung over their shoulders and rifles in hand, marched past the hospital without noticing the nurses peering out from the windows, trying to understand what was happening. Elena rose, slipped on her white coat over her nightgown, buttoning it carefully, as always. She knew today would be different. The day before, she had heard the chief doctor, Dr. Koval, speaking on the phone. "No, we can't evacuate everyone. Most patients are serious cases. They won't survive the journey." His voice was quiet, but trembling. Elena didn't like thinking about bad things. She was a nurse. Her world was built on order, cleanliness, care, and calm performance of duty. Even when tending to wounded frontline soldiers, she tried not to look them in the eyes, so as not to see their pain. She was beautiful, tall, with dark hair pulled back into a strict bun, a straight nose, and delicate lips that never smiled too broadly. People called her the Dove, but she didn't consider herself special. She just did her job. But today, everything changed. At 6:15 a.m., German soldiers stormed into the hospital. Not aggressively, more like by accident. They entered the reception area, where the senior nurse was sitting, and asked for the chief doctor. When Koval came out, one of the soldiers, young, with pale eyes and a hard gaze, spoke in Polish. "We're taking your hospital under protection. All doctors and nurses must remain at their posts. No hostile actions toward us, and you'll be fine." Elena heard this, standing at the door of the ward. She didn't understand what "under protection" meant. Did that mean they wouldn't shoot? What if fighting broke out? What would happen to the patients? The next day, June 21st, Captain von Stein arrived in Wehrmacht uniform. He was tall, clean-shaven, with cold gray eyes. He went to the administration office and demanded a list of all the nurses with photos, age, marital status, education. Dr. Koval resisted. "We treat people, not collect data for the army." "You don't understand," von Stein said. "We need medical personnel, especially women. We're setting up special hospitals for officers and high-ranking officials, and we need nurses, beautiful, well-groomed, well-bred women. You can be useful." Koval shook his head. "We're not selling our staff. This is our hospital, and we decide who works here." Von Stein smiled, not kindly, but with a hint of disdain. "I'm not asking. I'm informing. You'll give me 12 nurses tonight. If not, I'll take them by force, and then you'll answer for the consequences." And so began a story no one expected. The story of what happened to beautiful nurses during World War II. 9 days later, June 30th, 1941, Hospital Number 7, Lviv. Elena stood by the window, looking out on the street. In the past few days, she had become part of a new order. Von Stein had chosen 12 nurses, Among them, those who were more than just beautiful. Elena, Olga, Tatiana, Marina, Anna. All were young, well-groomed, with higher or middle-level medical training. They were selected not for their skills, but for their appearance. One German officer, whom no one ever saw, gave instructions: choose only those whose faces are like angels. No one with chubby cheeks, no one with freckles. Only pure, fair-skinned women with kind eyes. Elena couldn't believe it. She was a nurse, not a model. Her job was caring for the sick, not being pleasing to the eye. But she could do nothing. Koval, angry and helpless, didn't fight. He told them, "Go. Maybe you'll have a chance to survive. Here, you might be killed. There, even if it's slavery, you'll be alive." So they left by bus, escorted by 2 soldiers. The journey took 3 days. They traveled through occupied territory, passing burned villages, bodies, children sitting by the roadside with empty eyes. Elena didn't look out the window. She sat with her head down, thinking of her mother in Kiev. She didn't know if her brother, who had gone to the front in 1940, was still alive. They arrived at a large military hospital in Brest, on the border with Belarus. The hospital was located in a former palace, huge with columns and golden chandeliers and park pathways. Now it belonged to the Wehrmacht. Inside, cleanliness, order, the smell of antiseptic and fresh water. But the air was cold, like in a museum. They were greeted by Dr. Hein, a German military doctor with a neat beard and glasses in a thin frame. He spoke Russian, but with a heavy accent. He introduced himself: "I'm the head of the medical corps. You'll work here exclusively with officers and high-ranking officials. Your task is to ensure maximum comfort, care, psychological support. You won't be dealing with ordinary patients. You are a special group." Elena didn't understand what he meant by psychological support. She thought it meant being kind, smiling, speaking softly. But she quickly realized it meant something else. The first day passed without incident. They received new uniforms, white coats, but with red trim along the edges, black stockings, heels. They were taught new rules: how to enter a ward, how to hold your head, how to speak, how to look. One of the nurses, Tatiana, said, "It's like an opera. We're actresses and they're the audience." But Elena didn't laugh. She felt this wasn't a game. It was a trap. November 1941. Hospital number 3, Brest. Winter came suddenly. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees. The hospital was warm, but inside her heart, cold. Elena barely recognized herself anymore. She was no longer a nurse. She was a maid for officers, a girl for the commander, an object for Dr. Hein. She worked with one officer, Major von Richter. He was wounded in the leg, not in battle. He'd been hit by shrapnel while driving in a car. His room was the largest, with a leather chair, a radio, a bottle of whiskey, and books. He insisted Elena be there every night. He said he needed calm, kindness, something human. He didn't touch her, not yet, but each day he grew closer. He looked at her as if she weren't a nurse, but something valuable, as if she were his reward for war. One night, when everyone else slept, he called her into his room. "Elena," he whispered, "do you know why you were chosen? Not because you're a good nurse, because you're perfect. You're like a painting, like music. I want you to be mine, not now, but later, when the war ends. I'll give you a house, money, life. You'll live in Germany. You'll be free." Elena didn't answer. She looked at him, and in her eyes was not hope, but fear. She understood he wasn't talking about love. He was talking about power, that she was his trophy, and if she refused, he could destroy her. She left without saying a word. The next day, she began searching for a way out. She wrote notes, hid them in the walls, asked for help from other nurses, but they were all prisoners too. Olga, for example, had already agreed to a relationship with one of the doctors in exchange for helping her get a letter to her family. Tatiana disappeared. No one saw her for 3 days. Then they said she had left due to health reasons. Elena knew it was a lie. She understood that in this hospital, beauty was not an advantage, it was a danger. The more beautiful a woman, the more she became an object, and the more she was used. April 1942, POW camp near Minsk. Elena hadn't been to the camp yet. She was sent there with the other nurses after Dr. Hain received orders from Berlin, quote, transfer all especially valuable nurses to camp number 17 for medical service to high-ranking officers and scientific experiments, unquote. The camp was in the forest, behind barbed wire. Inside, several barracks, a laboratory. On the grounds, guards in black jackets, armed with automatic weapons. No one could leave. No one could communicate with the outside world. There, Elena met others, nurses from different countries, Polish, French, Soviet. All were beautiful. All were chosen not for their qualifications, but for their looks. And all were stripped of freedom. One day, Dr. Hain arrived with a group of officers. He said, "We're starting a new project, Project Dove. We're studying the effect of a woman's psycho-emotional state on wound healing. We're also researching the possibility of using the female body as an energy source for restoring soldiers' fatigue." No one understood what he meant. But then they did. They began undergoing experiments, injections, electric shocks, food deprivation, long hours in cages. They were shown films of their families suffering, their cities burning. They were told they were heroes, that their work was vital for victory. But inside, emptiness. Emptiness that couldn't be filled. Elena remembered one day in June 1942, lying in a cage while Dr. Hain stood above her with a thermometer. He said, "You must feel happy. You're part of the great victory. You're a symbol of hope. Your beauty, it's our strength." She felt nothing. Only cold. Only fear. Only the desire to die. August 1943. Basement of the laboratory, camp number 17. That day, Elena learned her sister, Marina, was also there. They met in the basement. In darkness, dirt, the smell of blood. Marina was gravely ill. She had an infection from an experimental injection. Elena did everything she could. Washed her, gave her a little water, covered her with a blanket, but Marina died the next day. Elena didn't cry. She knew tears were weakness, but inside, a tear. She lost not only her sister, but herself. She decided she couldn't go on living. She wrote a letter which she hid in the wall. It read, "I was a nurse. I wanted to help, but they used me. I was beautiful, and therefore I became a victim. I don't know what will happen next, but I want someone to know, to remember, that beauty is not a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse. Sometimes it's a path to hell." Then she walked into the forest. She walked to avoid seeing others suffer. She walked for a whole week, starving, frozen feet, empty eyes. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she didn't want to be a prisoner again. She found a village. An old woman with white hair took her in. She didn't ask who she was. She simply gave her porridge, a warm blanket, and said, "You survived. That's what matters." Elena lived there for half a year. She didn't talk about the war. She didn't talk about the camp. She just was. And only when she saw children playing in the street, she realized she wanted to live, to be a mother, to be human again. March 15, 1944, 8 a.m., Camp Number 17, near Minsk, Belarus. Winter was just beginning to fade. Snow melted at the edge of the forest, turning into mud that clung to the nurses' boots. Elena stood by the fence, looking at the sky, gray, like ash. She no longer felt the cold. She was inside herself, in emptiness, where there was no pain, no hope, no fear, only silence. She knew today was assessment day. Every week, Dr. Hain evaluated the nurses' effectiveness. He measured their physical condition, emotional response, level of obedience. They were called subjects, not people. They were numbers. E7, O3, T9, M12.
Elena, E7. Her sister, Marina, was M12. She was gone now, but the number remained. It was engraved on a metal tag pinned to her chest. She never took it off. Even when lying in the dark at night, she felt it, cold, rigid, like memory. That day, they gathered in the central barracks. Wooden benches on the floor, posters on the wall in German, Die Schönheit dient dem Sieg, beauty serves victory. Below them, photos of beautiful women in white coats, smiling, looking at the camera, like an advertisement, like they were a product. Heine entered the room. He wore a black coat, glasses, a pale face. He didn't look at them. He stared at a screen showing data, temperature, pressure, stress levels, results of psychological resilience tests. Today, we begin a new phase, he said. We're studying the effect of appearance on medical service efficiency. We want to understand how beauty affects the patient's perception, how it can speed up recovery, how it can soothe. He paused. Everyone froze. For this, we need control. We'll conduct an experiment. You'll work with patients under different conditions, some in plain coats, no makeup, hair tied back, others in special uniforms with makeup, styled hair, jewelry. We need to compare who performs better, who earns more trust, who is more pleasing to the eye. No one asked why. None of them had the right. But Elena understood. This wasn't about medicine. This was about using women as tools, making them part of the war machine. April 1944. Laboratory, Dove. The experiment began. Nurses were divided into two groups. The first in simple coats, no makeup, hair in buns. The second in white coats with red trim, blush, lipstick, neatly styled hair. They were even allowed to wear small earrings. They worked with wounded officers. The group with beautiful appearance received higher ratings. Officers said they felt better when treated by a beautiful nurse, even if the same procedures were done by others. But Elena noticed the officers treated by the beautiful nurses became aggressive. They demanded more attention. They started talking about love, about the future, about taking them away after the war. They didn't see them as nurses. They saw them as women. And then changes began. One officer, Captain von Richter, started visiting E7 regularly. He said she was the best. She was the ideal. He brought her chocolate, flowers, letters. He asked her to be near him, not as a nurse, as a woman. One evening, when everyone slept, he came to her barrack. "You can escape," he said. "I can take you away. I have connections. We'll go to Germany. You'll live in a house, have everything you want. You will be mine, and no one will know." Elena looked at him. In his eyes was not just power, but pain. He was also a slave to this war. He also wanted freedom. But he couldn't understand that freedom wasn't belonging to someone, it was being yourself. "I don't want to be yours," she said. "I want to be free, without conditions, without obligations. I just want to live." He looked at her, and anger flashed in his eyes. "You don't understand what you are to me. You're not just a nurse. You're a symbol. You're hope. If you leave, you'll destroy my world." He left. The next day, Elena discovered her number, E7, had been crossed out in the list, replaced with free. She didn't understand what it meant until she saw she was moved to a special section, observation unit. May 1944, observation unit. It was quiet, very quiet. Elena lived alone in a small room, a bed, a table, a chair. No one entered. Food was delivered through a grill in the door, and every day, records: pulse, temperature, mood, behavior. She realized she was being used as a research subject. They wanted to understand how a woman reacts to complete isolation, how she loses connection with reality, how she loses herself. She began writing, not in a notebook, on the walls, on the floor, on her clothes. First numbers, then words, then full sentences. She wrote about her sister, about her mother, about Kyiv, about how she learned to be a nurse, about how she thought she was helping people. She wrote to not lose herself. 1 month later, Dr. Heine came. He sat across from her like a teacher. "Elena," he said, "you're writing. Why?" "To remember who I am." "And who are you?" "I'm a nurse. I'm a person. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm not a number." He smiled. "Interesting. You're the first to say that. Usually they just disappear or go mad. You're an exception. Perhaps you're the key to our project." "What project?" "Project Dove. We want to create the ideal woman, not for healing, but for control. A woman who will obey but still retain humanity. A woman who can influence men not by force, but by beauty, intelligence, softness. We want to use her as a psychological weapon." Elena froze. "You want to turn me into a toy?" "We want to turn you into a tool. And if you agree to cooperate, you'll get freedom. We'll return your name. We'll give you life. But if you refuse, you'll stay here until you lose yourself completely."
She looked at him. In his eyes was not just science, but a thirst for power. He didn't just want to study, he wanted to control. She didn't answer, but that same evening she began writing a new letter, not on the wall, but on paper. She folded it into an envelope, hid it under her pillow. August 1944, Camp Number 17. The camp began to stir. Rumors spread through the barracks. The Allies were approaching. The front was moving west. Germany was losing ground. The Germans began evacuating important facilities. Dr. Heine announced, "Today we begin relocation. Some nurses will be sent to Germany, some to other camps. Some will stay here. It depends on their value." Elena knew her time had come. She had to choose, stay or leave. But where to go? To Germany, not freedom. A new trap. To another place, possibly worse. She decided to try to escape. At night, when everyone slept, she left the barrack. She walked through the forest as before. She didn't know where to go, but she walked. She walked until she saw light, distant but alive. It was a village. She approached the house where the old woman lived, the same woman who had saved her a year ago. The woman recognized her. "You have returned," she said. "I thought you were dead. I survived, but I don't know who I am now." The old woman seated her by the fireplace.
You're alive, that's what matters. The rest will come. February 1945. Moscow. Elena arrived in Moscow. She was exhausted, with gray eyes, thin hands, but she was alive. She found work in a city hospital, not as a nurse, but as an assistant. She didn't talk about the past. She didn't tell anyone what had happened to her, but she wrote. She wrote at night when everyone slept. She wrote a book, not about war, but about herself, about how beauty could become a weapon, about how a woman could be used, even if she wanted to help, about how important it was to be oneself, even if the world wanted to change you. The book was titled, "I Was Beautiful, and Therefore I Was a Prisoner." She didn't become famous, but some people read it, especially women, especially those who were young, beautiful, and believed the world was always fair. She wrote to warn, to say, don't think your beauty is a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse. Sometimes it's a path to hell. 1950, Kiev. Elena returned to Kiev. She bought a house, raised children. She didn't tell them about the war. She only said one thing: be kind, be honest, be yourself. Don't let anyone use you, even if you're beautiful. She continued writing, but now not for the public, for herself, for those who would come after. She knew history repeated itself. People still chose beautiful women, not for help, but for use. In business, politics, art, sometimes in science, sometimes in war. And she wrote to remind, beauty is not a weakness, but it can be a weapon if used. And if you're beautiful, you must be especially cautious, because the world doesn't always value beauty. Sometimes it destroys it. June 10th, 1952, 10 a.m., Kiev. Elena Romanova's home. The sun shone brightly, as if forgetting the war. Outside, children playing ball, women with baskets, men on bicycles. Everything was peaceful. But inside the house, silence. Elena sat at the table writing. Her hand trembled, but she didn't stop. She wrote the final chapter of her book, The Memory of the Beautiful. It was not just her story, but the stories of other women she met in the camp, in the hospital, in the basement. Women who, like her, were chosen not for merit, but for appearance. She wrote about Tatiana, who disappeared and no one knew where she was. About Marina, who died from infection. About Olga, who agreed to be a wife to an officer, to get a letter to her family, and then never saw her children again. About those who survived, but never truly lived. She wrote to make sure they weren't forgotten, so that those who hadn't been born yet would know, beauty is not always a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse. Sometimes it's a path to hell.
Elena received letters every day. She answered, not all, but many. She wrote, "You're not alone. You're not crazy. You survived something no one should survive. And you deserve peace." 1960, Moscow. Elena became known, not as a writer, but as the voice of trauma. She began speaking to groups of psychologists, doctors, educators. She talked about how beauty could be a weapon, how a woman could be used even in noble causes, such as medicine. She said, "We think a beautiful woman is a gift from fate, but sometimes it's a sentence, especially if the world uses her, if it wants her to be not herself, but what it needs, if it wants her to be beautiful, to soothe, to impress, to control." She spoke about Project Dove, how the Germans tried to create the ideal woman, not for love, but for power. How they studied her reactions, her behavior, her feelings. How they wanted to use her as a psychological weapon. It didn't end with the war, she said. Today we see it in advertising, in politics, in business. A beautiful woman is often an object. She's used to sell products, to win votes, to show strength. And she often doesn't notice because she's told, "You're important, you're needed, you're the best." But she wasn't the best. She was convenient. And that was the scariest part. 1970, Kyiv. Elena was older. She was 60. She lived in a quiet house on the outskirts of the city. She had a grandson, Dmitry, 8 years old. He loved listening to her stories, but she didn't tell him about the war. She told him about flowers, birds, trees, about how important it was to be kind, honest, yourself. One evening, Dmitry asked, "Grandma, were you ever bad?" "No," she answered. "I was good, but the world wanted me to be different. It wanted me to be beautiful, and so I became a victim." Why? Because beauty isn't always strength. Sometimes it's weakness. Sometimes it's a door to captivity. Dmitry thought, "So it's better to be ugly?" "No," she said, smiling. "Better to be yourself, no matter whether you're beautiful or not. Because real strength isn't in appearance. It's in the heart, in the ability to say no, in the ability to stay yourself even when the whole world says, 'Be someone else.'" 1985, Kyiv. Elena died. She was 75. She died in her home, in bed, holding the book she had written. On the cover, a simple inscription, "Memory of the Beautiful." Many people came to her funeral, not just family, but students, doctors, writers. They came to honor her memory. They came because she helped them understand what beauty is, what freedom is, what humanity is. The newspaper wrote, "Elena Romanova, not just a writer. She was a witness. She was the voice of those who couldn't speak. She reminded us that beauty is not a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse. And that every person, regardless of appearance, must be free, because a free person is one who can be themselves."